Jesus' crucifixion under Pontius Pilate, that he was crucified, is as sure as anything historical can ever be. Now, these are not Christians, not actual biblical Christians in any sense. So that's the first fact. Jesus died by crucifixion. That doesn't give me him being alive from the dead. He's just dead at that point. So the second fact is this, that very shortly after Jesus' death, the disciples, they had experiences that led them to believe, that's an important word here, believe and proclaim that Jesus had been resurrected and had appeared to them. And I'll just say this fact, I'll summarize it as appearances to the disciples. That'll be the short version of fact number 2. So we have lots of sources for this one. There's over 9 independent sources. I'll just give you a few. We have Paul's writings coupled with his claims to have met Peter and James to confirm that they also had the same claims. 1 Corinthians 15 is going to be of interest for our study. In 1 Corinthians 15, there's a few verses there where there's what scholars agree, this is the by and large agreement, is a creed, an early church creed, and I think Paul agrees with me on this too, perhaps not. There's an early church creed, and it says this, I'll read it to you, 1 Corinthians 15:3. For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that's verse 3. That phrase is a statement that is indicating this is oral tradition formalized, and then he gives the creed, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the 3rd day in accordance with the scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at once, at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. And that phrase there, that's an early church creed that Paul's saying, I received this from other sources, and then I came and I gave it to you in Corinth. Now, Paul wrote 1 Corinthians in about 55 AD. But he had visited Corinth years earlier. But he's saying that he delivered this message to them years before he wrote 1 Corinthians. So this backdates it to before that time. Then he's saying that the creed itself was something he received that was formalized as a creed before he ever even made it to Corinth. And so you can safely date this to within 10 years of the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, and probably within 5 years, this creed. Now, does it mean that Jesus rose? No, that's not my point. The point is that from the very beginning of Christianity, we know that the appearances to the disciples, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, and his appearance to the disciples was what they were preaching. You see, I'm not saying that it's true yet. I'm just saying we know that that's what they were preaching from the beginning and from likely a Jerusalem source. So John Rogers, historian, he says this is the sort of data that historians of antiquity drool over. They just drool over this stuff. It just goes right back to the source. It's very close to the time that it actually happened. And it's a genuine belief. The disciples had a genuine belief. There's other sources I could quote on this, but I'll just, for the sake of time, I want to move forward. I'll quote Paula Fredrickson, who is not a Christian. She's a historian. She says, I know in their own terms, what they saw was the raised Jesus. That's what they say. And then all the historical evidence we have afterwards attests to their conviction that that's what they saw. I'm not saying that they really did see the raised Jesus. I wasn't there. I don't know what they saw, but I do know that as a historian, they must have seen something. So even non-Christian historians, this is, again, a consensus opinion that there was apparent appearances, or at least the disciples believed they had seen the risen Jesus, and this accounts for their preaching of the gospel. Lycona puts it this way in his book, The Resurrection of Jesus, page 372. He says, this conclusion is granted by a nearly unanimous consensus of modern scholars and may therefore be added to our historical bedrock. In fact, he goes on to say that the appearance to the 12, which is a group appearance, there's 3 group appearances in the passage here that goes back to our historical bedrock. It says the appearance to the 12 is perhaps the most strongly attested of Jesus' post-resurrection appearances. I mean, we also have it in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And yeah, we do have it in Mark, and we can talk about that in the back and forth talk we do. So the second fact is the appearance to the disciples, and it's not saying Jesus must have appeared. I'm just saying the disciples believed that they saw the risen Jesus. That much we can say historically. They were sincere. And we can talk about the suffering of martyrdom of the apostles and all that. The third fact that historians agree on is that within a few years after Jesus' death, Paul, the persecutor of the church, he converted after experiencing what he interpreted as a post-resurrection appearance of Jesus to him. In other words, the appearance to Paul. So that's my third fact, that Paul believed that he had an appearance. He converted and became a Christian as a result of that experience. And what he thought he saw was Jesus. Habermas himself says, who's the foremost expert on this subject, the evidence for the resurrection of Christ. He says virtually all scholars recognize Paul's testimony that he had an experience that he believed was an appearance of the risen Jesus. So those three facts aren't really seriously debated amongst scholars. And that's me I'm saying I don't want to have to prove every single thing in the world to you. I'll go, what do they already agree with? My statement now is the best explanation of those facts is the actual resurrection of Jesus. Park your skepticism for a moment and ask yourself, if the resurrection of Jesus was possible, it would be a good explanation of all those facts, wouldn't it? That Jesus died, that his disciples who ran in fear after his death suddenly say, we saw him risen from the dead, and they're willing to die based upon that claim, that this appearance happened not only to individuals, but also in group settings, and then the conversion of Paul based upon that same data. These are all things that do make sense if you say, okay, Christ did in fact rise from the dead. That would be a good way to explain it. And I think that other hypotheses will just fall apart when you try to compare them to this historical data. Now, the one thing I'd like to add is the empty tomb. The empty tomb does not have a consensus. What it does have is a majority, a growing majority. Habermas gives it a 75% majority. Very recently, I think he said it was 73%, he thinks. But he doesn't even include people who think the tomb was empty, but give a natural explanation. He only includes in that percentage those who think the tomb is empty and have no natural explanation. So if someone says swoon theory, stolen body, he doesn't even include them in that statistic. And so I think he should, but he doesn't. So here's real quick. Looks like I got about 4 minutes. So here's a few lines of evidence that support the empty tomb and why I would say we can add this to bolster our case for the resurrection. Every single gospel has the empty tomb. And it flows with the narrative. There's no signs in particular of any legendary development in Mark. It flows smoothly with the narrative in its original form that we have in the Gospels. Paul teaches it. It's implied strongly in the creed that I read to you that goes back to Jerusalem, to the first just few years of the early church. It has early attestation and multiple attestation. These are important historical criteria. It's also enemy attested. In Matthew 28, the polemic that the Jews had against the Christians was that the disciples stole the body of Jesus, which is the implication of this is that, in fact, the tomb was real. The tomb was, in fact, empty. There's other attestation. In Justin Martyr's dialogue with Trypho in the 2nd century, it's still hanging around. This empty tomb theft is still hanging around. In Tertullian at the end of the 2nd century, it's still around. They're still fighting against this stolen body theory. And nobody else challenged the tomb with anything else. No one said there was no tomb or the body was in the tomb. Even Celsus in the 2nd century writing against Christianity, he never challenges the empty tomb. And you would think that they would do this if they could. It would be expected of them. There's no competing traditions. We have the criterion of embarrassment because we have the testimony of the women that they found the tomb. Also, Joseph of Arimathea, a guy who was on the Sanhedrin, he's the guy that actually takes Jesus and puts him in the tomb, which is embarrassing to the disciples and the early church that they were not there. They were fleeing and running, and then Joseph of Arimathea does this. There's more. I got 2 minutes and 13 seconds if my clock is right. So let me share a couple things. The empty tomb tradition starts in Jerusalem. It starts in Jerusalem, and it's in the area of Jerusalem. Joseph of Arimathea is from a location about 4 miles north of Jerusalem. So here we have a well-known member of the Sanhedrin. Everybody knew the guys that were on the Sanhedrin. It's like being on the Supreme Court, And they're saying that guy, everybody knew his tomb, which you'd be able to find locally. I mean, if you were making the story up, you'd want to put him further away. So it's implying that this is more historical, more likely historical. We've even found first century tombs that are like the one described in the Bible. There's 3 different kinds of tombs. One in particular that we found, it does, some of them, they match the style of tomb with a bench and then the holes for the bodies to be placed later after they had decayed. So all this stuff works. In fact, only a rich man could afford such a tomb. And the tombs they found were near the garden gate of the temple, which it just is interesting because Joseph of Arimathea had a tomb in a garden. So there's a few of the things I'll yield my last 60 seconds, and I'll just say this: the point is, his resurrection is the best explanation of this evidence. I'll leave it to Paul to present an alternate explanation that is not ad hoc. Thank you very much.
Excellent. All right, Paul.
All right. So thanks again for having me on, guys. This is a passionate topic of mine for exactly the opposite reason. I used to believe this. I now no longer think there is. But let's just look at the claim. So did Jesus rise from the dead is obviously a historical style thing to prove. Pardon me. First, actually, I want to reiterate, I did actually stipulate two things here. I did stipulate that Jesus existed as a person. I know that a lot of my mythicist brethren and sistren will not like that necessarily, but I find for this, there's not really a lot of point in talking about that here. I don't feel like the case rests on whether or not he's historical, as odd as that sounds. But given that he was historical, if I'm granting that, the fact that he died is probably the most mundane thing you could possibly say about any person in history, that they died. So again, it's pretty easy to grant the first point that Mike made here, that Jesus existed and that he died. But in terms of history, history isn't like math where we have proof, where we can go through and actually say things that are proved. It's not even quite like science, in that, in science we look at the predictive power of something to evaluate whether or not it's a good theory or a good hypothesis. In history, what we deal with is the probability whether something happened. You never prove that something for sure happened. It's always probabilities. So within that, we have certainties, levels of certainty as historians describe, and that certainty is proportioned to a number of different factors. First of which would obviously be just the evidence that's on hand. How much evidence do we have, and what kind of evidence is it to support the claim that we're looking at? Another factor is the conventionality of the claim. So is it something grand or is it something mundane? And mundane is going to be a word I use a lot. So for example, you would need a different type of evidence to say that Abraham Lincoln cut down a cherry tree versus Abraham Lincoln hunted vampires in his spare time. Now, both of those claims have been made in literature, but obviously the cutting down a tree is a different claim than hunting vampires, and you'd need a different level of evidence to describe those two things. And then, unfortunately, there's a reality that certainty is also proportioned to how much time has passed since the alleged event. So if you had the same amount of evidence for two different claims, but one claim happened, say, 100 years ago, and another happened 1,000 years ago, just by the way history works, we're going to be more certain about the one that happened 100 years ago than 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago. That may not be fair, but that is actually just the way history works. Now, I actually anticipated that the phrase scholarly consensus or scholars agree was going to come up, as it often does. Now, scholars, there is unfortunately no way to really know what the consensus is. Now, Gary Habermas, whose name came up several times, allegedly has a database where he surveyed thousands of people who have published on the resurrection. Now, those include everyone from historians to New Testament scholars to philosophers to everyone. Now, Gary uses this database when he uses his talks. He's even referenced it in papers, but unfortunately, he's never shared this data with anyone. So until Gary shares this, there is no way to know what the consensus of scholars say. I would just like everyone to know that when Mike and I are talking about things, I think I trust his scholarship, and hopefully you guys will all trust mine, to know that when we talk about scholars, that there are PhDs on both sides of each of these issues. And when we're bringing things up, there are people who are well-meaning, well-educated, and honestly sincere and looking for truth, who will agree with either what I'm saying or what they're saying. But we don't know whether it's 51%, 61%, 70%. This number 90%, I'm actually curious to talk about later, where that comes from, if not from Gary. But history ultimately isn't a vote. It actually doesn't matter what 90% of scholars say. History isn't a vote. We're here to talk about what the evidence is today. So I will probably also talk about scholarship, but just note that that's not the way history works. Now, the resurrection of Jesus, if it happened, I think everyone would agree would be